Okay, the way this is going to work is that I'm going to try to moderate a debate because we have had 3 very interesting and very challenging presentations with some things that coincide, some things that perhaps do not coincide that much. But rather than to highlight what are the similarities and the differences, I would like to delve into certain aspects that probably haven't been touched that much, and also what are the solutions, how do we go forward. So I'm going to try to raise a few questions with you, try to get quick answers from all of you, and then perhaps leave some time for anyone from the audience to come and give a talk. I'm going to start with the first one, which is something that came out in one way or the other in different presentations, which was there are factors that drive discontent that seem to be evident and grounded, whether they are cultural factors or they are economic factors or a combination of both in interaction. But there's a lot of perception. There's a lot of psychological issues. It was highlighted that although migration seems to be a clear driver of discontent and anti-system voting, that very often it is much more linked to perception than to reality, and people that live in the places where you have the lowest level of external migration that seem to be the ones that feel more threatened by the change in the so-called system. So to what extent do you think that this drive towards greater discontent is mainly driven by reality, or is it just mainly psychological? So who wants to start?
Okay, I'll have a go at this. So I think my position has to be it's driven by very real forces. But, can you hear? Oh, do I have to switch it on? Aha, okay, yeah. So obviously I'm arguing that it's based on some real trends, social, economic, political. There is definitely a reality of rising inequality over the past 30, 40 years. I mean, it varies across countries, but it's definitely the case that in most places, real wages at the median, and especially in the lower part, have tended not to rise quite so quickly. So all of these are realities. But at the same time, for that to be converted into a political response, somebody needs to articulate and interpret that reality and come up with also ideas to confront that reality. And this is where it starts to get a bit more interesting. I have a colleague, Mark Blythe. He wrote a very interesting book on austerity, which some of you may have heard of. He has this idea that in the end there is no such thing really as material interests without some theoretical structure to give life to them. So he has this great phrase, interests don't come with an instruction sheet. So, you can be in a given position in a social and economic system, but how do you know really what your position is unless there is some kind of theoretical apparatus that can help you interpret what the reality you observe actually means on a bigger scale. So a great example of this is migration. There is a big debate in Britain, and especially around Brexit, about what was the effects of migration on wages. So there are political actors that argue that large-scale migration from lower-income countries in the European Union to the UK depressed the wages of British workers. And this is a very strong belief amongst a lot of people. But as far as I'm aware, all of the attempts by economists to show that there was some effect of immigration on wages proved almost nothing. There was very little effect. And whatever effect there was marginal. And yet this belief is there, right? There is a very strong belief that migration pushed down wages. Well, of course, wages were not doing very well, and there was migration happening, so it's a very easy jump to assume that migration is causing that change, right? So I think there are realities and then there are political interpretations. And in the end, this anti-system politics that we're talking about is the political interpretations. My just final point, though, is that I'm not saying the reality is so great. In the great scheme of things, as Rune was saying, yes, we are living longer, we are richer, yes, in the great scheme of things. But in the shorter run, over the last 10, 20, 30 years, for a lot of people, life has not got better and in some ways has got worse. So that reality is at the heart of all of this. But we need to fight back against the crazy interpretations, the wrong interpretations, the dangerous interpretations of what all of this means.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. So I think it is. There are fundamental economic processes behind this, and I think, I mean, immigration is just a symptom, I think, of the broader change in the system. So when you see old industrial regions in decline, they are protesting against globalization, and immigration is an aspect of that. And that doesn't mean that they are receiving a lot of immigration, but it's a reflection of the broader system. But then you can be prone to discontent in a region, but you still need political entrepreneurs who can mobilize that, and that is essentially what these parties are doing. So, and why we see suddenly quite sudden rises. It doesn't mean that necessarily the political opinion shifts dramatically over a couple of years, but it is because there are some political entrepreneurs who are able to tap into the underlying discontent and to mobilize that, and then that takes then slightly different directions in different countries because they are pulling different strings. So it's not just about the kind of underlying conditions, but it's also, of course, about how some people are able to exploit those for political reasons.
With the risk of sounding too cynical, I'm quite agnostic towards the difference between the observed changes and the actual changes, as long as they lead to the same outcome. And I think that's one of the mistakes many of my economist colleagues have done over the course of 10 years or so, particularly when I was observing as an external party the Brexit debate, that there was this massive effort to convince people that there would be a number of economic consequences associated with Brexit, whereas the people that were going to the ballot didn't care about those. That their motivation to vote in a particular way was by and large dictated by what they perceived to be a threat to their identity. And I don't think it is productive to sort of question the validity or the validity of that kind of sensitivity. That it may not mean much to me personally, or that it may not mean that identity may not mean much to the urban population, or what we would consider to be the population that dominates the center. But at the end of the day, it matters for a good deal of people, and we need to understand how to respond to that. And to that end, I think political innovation, or the entrepreneurial attitude in politics, is really important. That we cannot sort of craft a political narrative that only caters to what we believe to be important, but it has to be all-encompassing when you look at the population at large. And immigration is one of those issues. You may not be exposed to immigration in your own area, but if the country is going through a rapid demographic change and a good deal of people in the country don't like it, you have to deal with it. You have to respond to it. You can't just explain them that they are being silly by not accounting for the real effects, that this is all perceived, that you need to actually take into consideration that they are affected, but in perhaps not tangible ways, that, through their cultural context or their identity. So that's the way I feel.
So probably we need also to do more research on perceptions. And,
absolutely.
Since especially Jonathan brought in his reply the role of migrants, and I know that all of you in one way or the other have been involved in not just studies of diversity and migration, but also actively, very often politically engaged in these issues. One question, and I'm going to start with an anecdote about the role of different waves of migration. And I remember a few days before the Brexit referendum, I went to have my hair cut, and my barber in London is from Kosovo. And he asked me, Andres, what are you going to vote in the Brexit referendum? So I couldn't vote because I'm a foreigner, but I then gave my talk, 5 minutes, saying, Blake, you have to vote whatever you like, but there are so many advantages of being in the European Union relative to being outside. And he listened to me very attentively. We get along extremely well. He's been my barber for 20 years. And then he said, yes, I see your points. I understand what you're saying, but you know, I think I'm going to vote for Brexit. And he's from Kosovo. And I said, why? Why are you going to vote for Brexit? And he said, there are far too many foreigners in this country. And that was in London. And we know from the Brexit vote that many, for example, of the previous wave of migrants, many South Asians actually voted for Brexit because they were promised that they were going to get benefits of that. So to what extent do you think previous migrants and previous waves of migrations in countries like the ones you not come from but have been working on, Sweden, Norway, and the UK, that have received large waves of migration for quite some time, have played a role in this rise of populism, and they have actually fueled the rise of populism itself, not as migrants, but also as voters. So who wants to start?
You're looking at me. In a way, we're all migrants here, right?
Yes.
I'm the failed migrant because I had to go back to my country. So I reverse migrated. To get a job, I had to go back to Britain. But really, ideally, I would have stayed here or in Italy. But yeah, and the one interesting. So in Britain, our experience of migration, we have kind of two broad experiences. In broad brush terms. One is the post-war migration from the Commonwealth, from the former empire. We don't use that word, but that's what it was. And then more recently, especially after 2004, migration from the European Union. And one of the most surprising things for me, I kind of expected when a large number of especially Polish workers came over to the UK, but also, and especially after the financial crisis, a lot of Mediterranean Italian, Spanish, especially in London. I would have expected this would have been the easiest form of migration for native British people, if such a thing exists, to cope with. And instead, actually, it has not worked out that way. So as Andres said, many people from the Commonwealth or descendants of Commonwealth migrants actually quite like the idea of Brexit because they expected it may make it easier for them to bring relatives in. The latest data I was reading yesterday, for 2021, migration to the UK, migration inflows are higher in the last year than in 2016, the year that we voted in the referendum, in which migration and reducing migration was clearly a big part of the political debate. But of course the mix has changed. Now we have more migrants from outside Europe. And so actually, in a way, this, I think, prioritizes the economic type of explanation, because the post-war wave of migration was in a period of full employment and rising wages, and it was much more based on ethnic resentments, I think, and had fewer political consequences ultimately. This latest one coincides with a period of economic stagnation and with fewer justifications, if ever there could be justifications for having any ethnically based resentment. So I think the British case, proves my point. But also I think it suggests that, we need to think of migration beyond the cultural argument. It clearly matters, but in the end, migration is, as Andres said, it's kind of wrapped up in globalization, and is, in some ways a symptom of all of the things about the contemporary economy that cause people pain.
Yes, so the political, this is not something I've studied a lot, the political consequences or the political culture of migration, but I think there are two dynamics there. So in terms of the majority, or the Norwegian ethnic population, I think the pattern in Norway is a lot like what Özge described, that we see the populist movements rising mainly in areas with low immigration, so more in the rural areas, more in the periphery, whereas the more diverse cities tend not to support that. But it's also of course, partly related to the economic dimension. But then I think the political culture of the migrants themselves is quite interesting and really different depending on who they are and why they come, and basically their reason for migrating. So in Norway, it's kind of mostly been political migrants or refugees, asylum seekers from that kind of before the EU expansion, where a lot of the political migrants came as kind of escaping different kind of regimes, so they are often left-wing politically and then kind of supporting the system. Whereas when you have broader groups of migrants, Norway is a social democratic system with a very kind of strong social democratic political culture, I think, across the spectrum of parties, and many migrants, I think, don't share necessarily that culture. So I think that's why you see a lot of migrants actually in some of these anti-system parties as well, because they are kind of in quite advanced political positions in those parties, because they are not necessarily buying into the social democratic system, and they are seeing more weaknesses in that. So I think it's a mixed picture. And then you have with the EU expansion, of course, the same development as you had in the UK, with a lot of migrants from Central and Eastern Europe, often taking working class jobs, having quite a different geographical pattern of settlement. So they are settling much more across the country and not concentrating into the cities in the same extent as more of the migrants and asylum seekers did. And then they are, I think, taking on more of the same kind of political opinions as other people living in those regions. So I think it's quite nuanced in terms of the political culture, depending on the country of background, the reason for migrating, and where they end up settling and what kind of job they end up taking. But for sure, it's the same kind of pattern, I think, as in the UK, that the competition, especially in the low-skilled end of the spectrum, is increasing, and that is something that has some kind of political consequences for populist parties.
So I'm an immigrant raised to the power of two, I say. When I went to England, I became the Swedish academic. All of a sudden, my Turkishness dropped completely. So that there are several identities one works with. But I mentioned yesterday when we were conversing about this issue that multiple identities can coexist as long as they're not in direct conflict with each other. And I think the way people react to different waves of immigration has a lot to do with that. Two of my colleagues rather recently, and quite unfortunately so, found that more than 60% of immigrants coming from Middle East and Africa will never ever have a sufficient or self-sustenance level of income in Sweden. And that is quite problematic in a country that takes so much pride from having a very well-functioning social welfare net. And the only way that social welfare net can sustain itself, which is almost like a religion of its own in the context of Sweden, that no matter where you are on the political spectrum, everybody has to respect the social welfare system, that there's this general sentiment around. So what secularism is for French, social welfare is for a Swede almost. And the moment you feel like that's being threatened, may you be an immigrant that adopted the Swedish identity later in life, who migrated prior to this quote-unquote crisis, or may you be a native Swede having lived in Sweden 7-8 generations back, your sensitivity comes from the same place. So most of the immigrants that show a certain type of sentiment towards a rapid change in the society do not differ that much from what you would consider to be a native Swede. In fact, I think talking about them as as a surprising subpopulation behaving in a way that we wouldn't expect them to behave is a bit of a bigotry of low expectations. because they are a part of that society just as well.
If you allow me to be a bit politically incorrect, I'm going to raise the issue of race.
Sure.
Does race play a part, especially taking into account what you said? In the UK, first waves of migrants were normally clearly identifiable in terms of ethnicity, whereas if you get a Polish migrant or you get a Lithuanian migrant, it's very difficult to distinguish a Lithuanian from a Brit. Whereas in Sweden it was the opposite. For example, the first waves of migrants were white, Chilean, Bosnian, Croatian, perhaps Serbian. Later waves have been mostly different in terms of ethnicity.
Well, we had the Persians coming from Iran, and they were distinctly different. They were as visible of a minority as any other minority could be, and they perform way better than the native population, and no one has a problem with them.
Okay. Jonathan?
I'm conflicted in this because on the one hand, as a political animal, my instinct is to try and eliminate race from the discussion to the extent that articulating patterns of social difference around race is something that very obviously is a dangerous path. But as a social scientist, you cannot ignore that it is part of how people construct, using that term again, how people mentally construct the world around them. And not only that, people's behavior is driven by connections they have, which are founded on cultural but also potentially ethnic similarities. So this is a reality. If you look at the staff at LSE, the people working in the waiting and the kitchens tend to be Europeans, very often either Eastern Europeans or Southern Europeans. The people doing the cleaning tend to be Latin Americans or Africans. This reflects the social stratification, but it also reflects people's relations. People get jobs because they know other people who are doing those jobs, and so you get communities which reflect ethnic differences. Not always in a bad way, sometimes also in a good way, creating a sense of solidarity. The cleaners at LSE have been very successful at creating a union and mobilizing solidarity to win better working conditions for themselves. And there was a very strong sense, I think, amongst them that partly they were not only being mistreated because of the low social status of their job, but also because of their race. So this feeds into the politics in interesting ways, and not always necessarily in sinister ways. And I think we need to, think about how, the way in which we see ourselves and see others can be also a potential for growth and for connection rather than simply division.
Mm-hmm. Let's start moving towards what is going to happen in the future and what are the solutions. And many, including myself, thought we just need to let anti-system parties govern. And then there would be a vaccine against, and I'm using the term vaccine on purpose. And of course, I think Rune has compellingly shown in his presentation that we have let these parties govern in big countries. They've been in Poland, in Hungary, in Italy. They've been in the UK, in the US, in Mexico, in Brazil. And what we have, it has been probably in certain areas an unmitigated disaster, especially in the handling of COVID-19. So many of these leaders have been anti-vax. They have been skeptic of scientific advice. Boris Johnson partying like crazy until he actually caught COVID. Bolsonaro not wearing a mask and deciding this is just a grippinha, so something irrelevant. Of course, Donald Trump having COVID and just going and hugging people around, saying it doesn't matter, I told you it's not important, or López Obrador in the case of Mexico, leading, just disregarding this and leading the country with the biggest impact in terms of excess mortality. And yet, we keep on voting for them. not just in the same numbers, in bigger numbers. Boris Johnson, it was before the pandemic, but he got a much bigger level of support than Theresa May in the previous election that won by a whisker. Trump did better despite losing the presidency. Viktor Orban has been capable of beating the whole opposition from the extreme right to the extreme left together by an even bigger margin than before. And Bolsonaro, Putin, López Obrador remain popular in their countries. Why do you think this is the case? And what can be done to make sure that this sort of leaders actually become unpopular?
I mean, I'm not sure of that. I mean, because we are democracy, so of course it's the voters who decide in the end. So it's not about letting them govern or not letting them govern. That's for the public to decide. But I mean, I think this is part of the reason why I try to use this allegory between the communist movements 100 years ago, which were anti-system, which the system establishment were really afraid of, and the current anti-system movements is, you know, a lot of these communist movements, they won power, they kept power for a number of years. They established a parallel system for 70 years in Eastern Europe or in the Soviet Union, right? And it was a system that was clearly worse than the one they were opposing in the end. I mean, it delivered horrible outcomes. So I think even if we kind of believe that the system we have is superior, that's no guarantee for why another perspective won't win through politically and won't kind of destroy the system. So I think there is that risk still, and I think one of the reasons for this problem is that it is very, very difficult for the central elites to understand the perspectives of the people in the periphery or the mass public. So a lot of these perspectives that they have, they basically don't really see them, and I'm kind of, as a scientist, as somebody living in a city, I also don't really understand those perspectives, right? And that's why we have to work harder on trying to understand and trying to see where this discontent is coming from, because I think it has to start there, and that you need, in a way, and structurally I think it's very difficult to do, but that is where you can find the solution, is basically you can understand this and then you can come up with a different kind of solution that you can convince. But you need to understand how somebody thinks before you can convince them of something.
I had no idea what Rune was going to present today, and I've been really amazed by how many overlaps I found with what I think is really important and what you presented there along the line center and periphery. I mean, I just think that the center and periphery operates at a more local level, at the regional level, so the center of a region and the periphery of the region rather than the capital of the country versus elsewhere. But I mean, to be practical, I'm not a political scientist, I'm an economist, but the way I observe it, given all these variations that we observe across all sorts of places, it does amaze me how little effort is allocated into not only understanding the different experiences of people that's been diverging over the course of, 20, 30 years, more rapidly than ever. That it is at an increasing rate less likely for a sort of an urban global citizen to understand the lived experiences of somebody living at the periphery of a country. But there's very little effort in terms of political mobilization. That we still so that the game has changed, but the rules we are operating with are from a time where you could come up with some narrative, some discourse that operates at the national level, and then you expect people to buy into it. But I think it has to happen at the local level. So almost in the old school, local politicians, personal relationships with the local businesses type of idea, or local agents type of idea, we may need to revisit, I think.
Jonathan?
When I decided I wanted to become a political scientist, it was because I was so upset at what I perceived as being the terrible things Margaret Thatcher inflicted on my country in the 1980s. I thought, how can people vote for this nonsense? If only they understood better they maybe would vote for better policies. So I dedicated myself to understanding politics better so I could maybe help communicate some better ideas to people. As I said before in my presentation, none of my Brexit voting relatives asked my advice before voting to leave the European Union, despite 30 years of me studying European politics. And the problem we have is that although I'm a firm believer in democracy, and I'm a firmer believer still that our current democracy doesn't listen enough to people, we should also understand that very often politicians don't listen to people for good reasons, because people don't understand very well many of the things that politicians have to decide about. There is this famous phrase from H.L. Mencken, who's an American writer, essayist in the early 20th century, and he says that democracy is like running the circus from the monkey cage. And I think this metaphor explains well how apparently ridiculous politicians like Silvio Berlusconi or Beppe Grillo or Boris Johnson or Donald Trump can be so successful, because they communicate simplistic and appealing discourses that do not translate into intelligent policy, I think, most of the time, even though I have to admit that I find Donald Trump a very, very troubling person. And he, it makes me feel almost ill to listen to Donald Trump. But he had connected with the very reality that trade liberalization had destroyed communities in the United States, something which somebody much more appealing and intelligent for perhaps an educated audience like us, Hillary Clinton, had failed to communicate. She called the people who were worried about this despicables, right? So I think, populist politicians are dangerous. I don't think they have really many answers to our problems. But mainstream politicians need to understand why they're not being listened to. And I think there are good reasons why many people no longer listen to mainstream establishment politicians.
Jonathan, don't feel bad that your relatives didn't ask for your advice. As I said, it can be worse. My barber asked for my advice and voted for Brexit. So that's an indication of how much expert advice is valued these days. But the last question from me, which is probably getting out your crystal ball, or just imagine that you, rather than living our lives as academics and researchers, you decide to become decision makers and you're elected prime ministers or presidents of your countries. What would be the...
Knock on wood.
Knock on wood? Okay, so you're running for it? Tell me, what will you do? What would be the main sort of policy that you would implement? Although I think Özge has already advanced on that, to address this pervasive and in some cases growing discontent.
Greater local autonomy and decentralization, I think. I am increasingly in favor of not only approaching this issue from an accounting perspective and look at it how transfers happen between different regions or within a region, but also change the structure in which accountability can be assigned to local politicians and policymakers at a reasonable rate, at least. Maybe not like turning a switch, going from one system to another overnight necessarily, but this is something we need to start thinking about. That some of the discontent, or rather some of Euroscepticism that we observe, for example, originates from the fact that people that had some skepticism towards their central governments were then introduced with yet another level of government that's like a supranational level of government. So with every layer of government, they are feeling, again, this is the perception, they're feeling like they are being removed away from decision making one step at a time. So that maybe this can change the game the way I see it. But I have absolutely no aspirations to become a politician and or a policymaker. So that's.
I think it's really important that we invest in knowledge production and knowledge infrastructure in peripheral regions. I think that's something that the government can do, and something that requires quite a radical reshaping of the system. So I think today the ideology is that knowledge production requires density, requires critical mass, and that has led a lot of policymakers to think that the return on investment is higher if you invest in central areas. Basically then the government is actually, and the public investments is making this worse. So I'm from economic geography, where people are often kind of critical of the dynamics going on in the economy and in capitalism, but actually when you look at how this system is skewed, it's often the political decisions that are even more skewed than the capitalist ones or the private ones. And I think that is partly an ideology that has been dominating in economics, in regional studies for a long, long time, and that has influenced policymakers to basically steer their investments in the knowledge economy towards central areas. And I think at least what the government can do is try to counteract rather than reinforce these patterns.
So I completely agree with both of these points. I think more local autonomy is very important, although Spain in some ways offers some counter lessons for that experience. I think more education is crucial as well, especially at the lower level. I think the real problem we have in a lot of places is that we've invested a lot in university education, and of course we all welcome that, but education for people who leave high school level is in some ways possibly more important, because of course education is one of the key divides now in our politics. I think in the end we need to do something about political participation. You can set up institutions, but if people don't participate, then they are not going to do the job of connecting people to policy. For a start, I think compulsory voting would be an interesting thing. It doesn't necessarily solve every problem, but both in Britain and in Spain, turnout levels are very low. And this is terrible because people don't feel that they own any of the political decisions being made. So I think also we need to find either an evolution of or a substitute for political parties. I'm really not sure what this would look like, but the fact that political parties are now a shell, largely, I mean, I'm a member of the Labour Party in Britain, and I have to admit, even as a political scientist, it is so boring and pointless to go to the meetings of my political party that I get involved as little as possible. Today there are local elections in Britain. I'm very embarrassed to say that I forgot to cast my postal vote. So today I am abstaining from elections. I think we need to facilitate, encourage, make it easier, make it in some ways an obligatory part of citizenship for people to be involved in politics. I spend my life obsessing over it, and I understand why so many people don't care. But people need to care, because then they can't come around and say, nothing works, the political system sucks, what's happened to my community? We need to all be involved. Democracy is that, it requires involvement, it requires people to contribute. So we need to think how we can design institutions to make sure that people do that.
Okay, so I think we have a solution. We have a combination of decentralization with responsibility and accountability, knowledge production and knowledge infrastructure, and more political engagement and political participation. I'm conscious that we're coming to a close, but if there are any questions coming from the audience, now is the time to ask them. Otherwise, you should remain silent for the rest of this debate, at least. So any urgent questions from the audience? I think you answered all the questions. Oh, yes, one. Go ahead, please.
Oh, sorry for my rusty English, but I will myself understand. I have seen some contradictions in your showing up out of your presentations. The rise of populism is, according to them, mainly a result of growing inequalities. Whereas, as Dr. Rune said in his presentation, we are better than 50 years ago. in terms of GDP, in terms of life expectancy, as you said, etc., etc. It's also access to social services is better than 50 years ago. How do you interpret this contradiction, as I see it?
Mm-hmm.
It's a mystery.
Any other questions coming from the audience? Yes, so if we go 2 questions over there and then we'll wrap it up. So one and then one at the back.
My question is...
Again, the microphone, please.
Thank you. My question is how to link technology with politics, how to checks and balance, and something to allow people to participate daily in the political life, right?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then the last question coming from the back. ¿No había una pregunta ahí? No? No. All right, so then we stop at these 2 questions. So who wants to go for the first one on the contradiction between, on the one hand, having it better than ever before and rising inequalities?
You want to go?
Shall I jump? I try to emphasize this bit, and I don't know if we are on the same page about it, but this is exactly what I meant when I said absolute versus relative. That you can infinitely improve the conditions of people and places, but if you have an ever-widening gap between these places, particularly when they are so close with one another, and it's very easy to observe the others, it's not going to help. And that's something we have to be very cautious about. We don't analyze it so much. Politicians absolutely don't analyze it so much. They don't understand the concept of opportunity cost so much. It's often about the accounting costs, how much something costs and what do you get in return. That's the way most of the infrastructure investments, for example, are thought about. Oh, there was no school here before, I made a school here now, so it's all better. But if you have in the neighboring region 2 new schools, or if you have a better school that's being established, the fact that you allocated this kind of resource into this area will do nothing. If anything, it may actually piss people off even more. The way I understand this improvement in everything and still having these divergences we observe, I think that's the absolute versus relative bit. I don't know if...
So, and I would say also that, regardless of whether a system works, it will always work better for some than for others, and that creates a political cleavage or a political division between those that it works well for and those that it works less well for. So I think this is something that is hard to escape politically, because there will always be different interests that are driving the political debate. So I think my point is mainly that the kind of direction that this anti-system movement is coming from has changed because the economy has changed. So it's no longer from the left wing, but it's from a new type of political movement, which is what we've mainly analyzed. So even if the system works also for them to some extent, it works less well for them, and they are struggling to compete in it.
And what about, well, I don't know, Jonathan, whether you want to add something about this?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking if we compare how we grew up and how our kids are growing up, in many ways they're so much better off than us. But I also remember I used to play on my bike in the street. And you could do that, right? I could go to school on my own. My parents didn't feel they needed to take me to school because they weren't terrorized by the idea of pedophiles prowling. There are so many ways in which I think objectively, materially life has got better, but in other ways society has broken down in some ways. Social connections have become more difficult. This varies across countries a lot. I think it's far less true of Spain than it is of Britain. But there are a lot of people on their own, especially with aging society, this becomes more the case. A lot of people who don't have satisfying social connections or have unstable social relations. And a huge amount of anxiety and depression. Our mental health, I think, is worse. Our physical health is probably better, but our mental health as societies is probably worse. So I think in a way, there is a balance, and in some ways, less modern societies may be happier. I'm I'm not going to exclude the possibility that in some ways, some of the traditional values that politically I reject may not necessarily be such a bad thing for societies as a whole. I'm getting old enough to start to sound conservative now.
Okay. All right.
Actually, one last point, just to prove I'm really young at heart. On the question of technology, I think people need to be able to vote with a smartphone. We need to find a way. I can pay off my mortgage with my smartphone. Why can't I vote? If people are not voting, and if people below a certain age are interacting with each other largely through these technologies, we need to use them in politics. I'm not really sure how, but I don't think we can ignore that. You can't expect kids to put a cross on a piece of paper when everything else they do is mediated through the internet.
Okay, so any famous last words on technology, or we can finish it there? So I think we should wrap this up with a big round of applause to everyone who has participated. Y si me dejan para concluir, y en español, pues no quería acabar en primer lugar sin agradecerles sobre todo a ustedes, el público, el haber pasado, pues al final ha sido 5 horas prácticamente con nosotros, escuchando, atendiendo, haciendo preguntas muy incisivas. Quería agradecer a nuestros sufridos intérpretes que han tenido la dificultad de no saber hasta, iba a decir el último minuto, el último segundo, si íbamos a hablar en español o íbamos a hablar en inglés. Además, yo creo que la tendencia, sobre todo mía, si hablo en español, a hablar mucho más rápido que cuando hablo en inglés, lo cual puede ser un problema. Así que muchísimas gracias. Agradecer a Paula Sánchez y a todo el equipo que ha estado detrás ayudándonos en la preparación de este foro. Agradecer a Juan Viña y a la Fundación Cañada Blanch por no solo financiar el foro, sino por todo el apoyo que está haciendo desde hace ya muchos años a que en Londres tengamos la capacidad de juntar gente española, británica, pero también de otros sitios que están interesados en temas que tienen una importancia vital para España y para el resto del mundo. Y después, antes de acabar, a la Universidad de Valencia también por darnos el local y por facilitar este claustro magnífico en el que estamos y participar aquí, y animarles a que nos visiten en el Centro Cañada Blanch en la London School of Economics. Creo que es una oportunidad. Tenemos un centro que ofrece la posibilidad de pasar trimestres en Londres, en la London School of Economics. Yo creo que lo podemos decir sin modestia, por lo menos Jonathan y yo, una de las mejores universidades del mundo, la segunda mejor según los rankings en ciencia social, para poder conocer qué es lo que se hace allí, para poder hablar seguir las actividades que hacemos y sobre todo poder hablar y colaborar con investigadores que yo creo que pueden aportar y pueden contribuir a que la ciencia y sobre todo a través de colaboración, es lo que decía Rune, de hablar con la gente, interactuar, para que se pueda fomentar este vínculo y podamos avanzar en investigación que tenga un impacto profundo sobre la mejora de las calidades de vida de las personas, independientemente de si viven en Valencia, si viven en el resto de España, viven en el Reino Unido o en el resto del mundo. Entonces, les animo a que entren en nuestra página web. Es fácil, poner Cañada Blanch Centre LSI, vean todas las actividades que hacemos y, si se animan, pues vengan a visitarnos como fellows, vengan a los foros que les emplazo ya para el año que viene, vengan a todas las actividades que hacemos, tanto en presencia en Londres, en colaboración, por ejemplo, con el Instituto Cervantes de Londres, pero también muchas de las actividades que hacemos en línea, y vamos a tener 2 de estas actividades en las próximas semanas. Dentro de 2 semanas, el día 24, tenemos una actividad en línea sobre inversión externa directa en Cuba y su impacto sobre la transformación de la isla, y después vamos a hablar también sobre multinacionales y inversión extranjera con uno de los principales expertos, que es además el decano de la Business School de la Universidad de Cambridge, que además es español, Mauro Guillén, en colaboración con el Instituto Cervantes. Así que les emplazo. Muchísimas gracias por todo, muchísimas gracias por el apoyo y nos vemos muy pronto. Gracias.